Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, how to fund social care is one of those very difficult subjects that keeps policymakers awake at night and sends politicians running for cover. There are simply no easy answers, it seems. During the last election, Theresa May came under a lot of fire for proposing using people's homes to fund their care costs. Some suggested it was one of the main reasons the Conservatives didn't win the election. However, for James Kirkup from the Social Market Foundation think tank, it's a policy that's progressive and must be revisited. And here's his soapbox. In the last half hour, Theresa May U-turns on social care funding, announcing a big change to her manifesto.
Theresa May changes a key election pledge on the cost of social care.
Theresa May is forced to backtrack on one of her key manifesto pledges on reforming social care in England.
Remember the dementia tax? The Conservatives got themselves into trouble with it during the election campaign. I'm not a Conservative, but I think the policy deserves a second chance. The policy would mean taking the costs of someone's care and old age from their estate after they die. That includes any property they leave behind. Now, I know people feel very strongly about leaving their house to their kids, but really, the alternative is worse. If we fund care costs from general taxation, we're asking today's workers, including young workers on low wages who can't even dream of affording their own home, never mind a lovely house like this one, to pay for the care costs of people who do have big homes, who can then pass those homes on to their children tax-free. That's not fair. Now, I know death taxes aren't popular, but they should be. In an age of anger at unfair concentration of wealth and privilege, I think there could be some real rewards for a politician who's brave enough to state plainly that the children of people with big houses should pay a little bit more tax on the houses that they inherit, don't earn, so that the working poor can pay a little less tax. So, at the heart of the dementia tax mess, beneath all the shouting, the anger, the campaign hysteria, there was a principle worth remembering when politicians, as they eventually must, try again to grasp the nettle of rising social care costs. Part of what upset so many people was that costs wouldn't be capped, so that someone with dementia would pay much more than someone who died suddenly of, say, heart failure. Now, I have my doubts about a cap, but realistically it's the only way to allay those concerns about a lottery risk arising from different sorts of death. For me, the other part of the policy, taking the cost of someone's care from their estate after they die, is more important and should be implemented. There's different ways you could do that. You could have a higher inheritance tax, a lower starting threshold for inheritance tax. You could charge capital gains tax on property on death. Ultimately, the method matters less than the principle. People who have more should pay more for care so that people who have less can pay less. The dementia tax was progressive. It should rise from the grave.
And James Kirkup joins us now here in the studio. James, you know that the Conservatives were taken to the cleaners during the campaign when this was announced, and a number of MPs and commentators cite it as the reason they didn't win an outright majority. So why do you think any politician would try and revive the plan?
Because it's time to have an honest conversation about things like care costs and the property market. I mean, we all know that the value of housing has gone up enormously. I mean, houses in the UK are worth something like £7 trillion at the moment. So that's up from about £4.5 trillion in the last 3 or 4 years. We are accumulating huge amounts of money in housing, and we can't go on preserving that through a tax system that favours inheritance. Yeah. Because if we don't do it that way, if we fund social care from general taxation, we are asking people who work today on low wages to pay tax so that people can inherit big houses tax-free.
I mean, this is a big issue, and people might say you have to be grown up about it, however difficult, and the reaction was pretty immediate and extremely anti in the time of the election. But if you are wealthy in terms of assets, should they be used?
So there are a number of issues you've raised. I mean, you're quite right that we should have a debate about this. This is a serious issue. The issue in the election was this idea of a cap. You mentioned that in your introduction, and the cap was the issue that people felt instinctively was something that was unfair. Not having a cap in terms of the running down the value to look
Wasn't the
after
concern
people
that their homes were
was
being used as part of the calculation?
No, but the issue was the cap, the fact that they would be a limitless liability. That was what frightened people.
And as you're still happy to fund social care from estates after death?
But I've said, I've been sat in the House for 7 years, and I campaigned in that election. I'd never seen a policy which had such a negative sort of reaction. The thing was announced on the Thursday, knocking on doors on the weekend. People immediately knew what was going on, and they didn't like it, and that's why we had to modify it. But what I would say is that I think this issue of the cap is vital. There has to be a cap.
I agree, but
ask your question.
Can we put the cap aside and just ask the simple question of funding care from estates after death, asking people to take some money from the house they would otherwise give to their kids? Shouldn't we just take the money from that estate and use that to fund social care? I mean, that was in your manifesto.
Even in the Osborne days,
do you still agree with that idea?
Even in the Osborne days, we were discussing this. We've been discussing this from 2011. But in those discussions, there was always this issue of a cap, which is fundamental. You said put the cap to a side. I think the cap is absolutely fundamental.
Right, I've understood that.
I wonder why you don't want to answer the question about whether or not we should fund care from states, given it was in your manifesto.
No, I'm saying that there's a
you
debate.
You do that, but you wanted a cap.
That.
So you do accept
and
that.
I do want a cap,
do you, Annalise, or should people with homes, estates, whatever, use that to fund their care?
I think the Labour position is very, very clear in our manifesto. We say that we want to have a cross-party approach, which of course is what was thrown out of the window at this election, which would look at, yes, potentially wealth tax. It would look at other forms of contribution, potentially an employer levy as well. What we saw happening at the last election was we did actually have some degree of cross-party consensus, I think, around some of the Dilnot proposals,
that's right.
which included a commitment to insurance, because that's essentially what a cap is. That was suddenly thrown out of the window, and we had this new policy being made up on the back of a fag packet or an envelope or maybe something even posher than that.
But you both agree in principle with the policy that is being put forward, or James Kirkup is asking to be revived?
I don't agree with suddenly 5 minutes later, which is what happened with the Conservatives at the general election, saying you'll have a £100,000 cut-off.
Yes,
you need to have something.
Points against the Conservatives. Simple question: should we use estates, inherited property, to fund social care?
Well, in the Labour manifesto, we say it's one of 3 elements that we should be looking at, so we've made that very, very clear. What we don't
you make sure you look at it, or you make sure you'll do it?
Yes, we have, as part of a cross-party discussion,
which
is what we had with Dilnot, and sadly we saw Dilnot being kind of chucked out for, I think, quite nakedly political reasons. We had cross-party consensus there. Why can't we try and have that again?
I mean, Dilnot's cap, isn't Dilnot's cap just a form of middle-class subsidy? I mean,
well,
it protects people who've got assets.
And that was why it was cross-party.
And this is a question for the Labour Party. I mean, you claim to be a progressive party.
Well,
you stood on a policy, on policies like tuition fees, of defending universal benefits for wealthy pensioners.
If it's cross-party,
why didn't you advocate progressive policies in the election?
If it's cross-party, there may be parts of it that Labour might not agree with. That's why it's cross-party, But we've got to be grown-ups. We've got to work together. And I felt like we were potentially doing that in social care in the past, because Labour had accepted that there might be some parts we wouldn't like, but we needed to have a cross-party solution. Then that got chucked out.
Let me just come back though to the core principle. I mean, there is a basic human desire on the part of many people. Do you understand that those people want to hand down or give part of their wealth to their children?
Yes, absolutely, yes, and that's why it's so difficult. And I completely understand from both your point of view why it's so difficult for politicians to advocate what's essentially a death tax. It's an emotive issue.
But are you suggesting
it is the least bad option here?
Well, we've both said that there was a cross-party consensus before the election on the Dilnot proposals and the idea, the notion, some cross-party support for the idea of a cap. I'm not sure what your paper is saying. I haven't had the privilege of reading it. Are you suggesting that we should get rid of a cap and go back to the original proposal in the manifesto?
Instinctively, I have problems with a cap, but I think in terms of realistic politics, there has to be some level of cap.
Well, because people with a long-term illness, like dementia, it would go on for years.
It's not like insurance, and there's no
I
insurance.
accept a cap. My point is, what I'm here to argue for what bluntly we have to call a death tax. Just asking people to fund social care from inherited estates, not general taxation.
James Kirkup, thank you for coming in.